Moves into it.
You're listening to A View from the Hill,
There it goes. It's high enough. It's long enough.
the Rugby League supporters program.
The beauty is straight between the posts. The score here now.
Hello and welcome to That's the Way It Was, a program that looks back at the history of rugby league. In episode 11, on the 20th of March 1897, 20 rugby league matches were played in the north of England. Amongst the results that day, Hunslet defeated the amateur Broughton Recreational by 75 points to 5, whilst Leigh and Wakefield Trinity played out a 0-0 draw. It was the beginning of a competition that would bring agony and ecstasy to rugby league supporters. It was the beginning of a competition that would create heroes and villains. It was the beginning of the English Rugby League Challenge Cup. 124 years later, the English Challenge Cup is the second longest running competition in the history of rugby league. It's a story that has to be told, and to help us tell this story, we're going to speak to author and historian Graham Morris, who's written a number of books on the Challenge Cup, including Destination Wembley, the history of the Rugby League Challenge Cup final. So Graham, welcome to That's the Way It Was.
Thank you.
Now, Graham, as I mentioned there in the introduction, the Challenge Cup starts in 1896-97. Why did they start this competition? What was behind? What were the reasons behind starting up the competition?
Well, actually, it was born out of. I'd say it was born out of necessity, rather than being any particular brainwave for a wonderful new knockout competition. The breakaway from the rugby union occurred in 1895 when 22 of the leading northern clubs of England broke away. There was more or less a 50-50 split of those clubs between Lancashire and Yorkshire.
Yes.
Prior to the breakaway, those clubs had only competed in their own counties, or I suppose the equivalent of a state in
Yes.
Yorkshire and Lancashire's equivalent to, say, Queensland, New South Wales. Lancashire clubs had only played against their own county, Yorkshire against their county. When the breakaway occurred, the 22 clubs, it was very ambitious. They decided that they would play a full league programme. Everybody would play everybody twice, which was 42 matches. So 50% of your away games, you had to travel over the Pennines to the opposite county, which isn't the greatest thing to be able to do in the 1890s, where obviously travelling wasn't what it is today. So after one season of that, they decided this just couldn't work. It was costly. It was difficult to get to the matches. So they decided to revert to the idea of split Lancashire and Yorkshire competitions. And this actually went on for the next 5 seasons. The problem with that was the togetherness of Lancashire and Yorkshire breaking away from the rugby union was going to be lost. So they decided the way around that was to bring in a cup competition, a challenge cup, if you like, which would embrace all of the clubs in Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the few that had also joined from Cheshire. And that's really why it was born. It was born so that the Lancashire and Yorkshire clubs still had competitive matches against each other. And obviously, that's grown and grown and grown, and we are where we are today with it.
Okay, now, Batley win the first final. They defeat St Helens by 10 points to 3 at Headingley, and in fact, Batley are quite successful in those early years. They win the Challenge Cup 3 times. Clubs like Hull and Warrington are also very prominent. But Graham, was the competition itself? The competition itself was a success. Crowd-wise and so forth.
I think in context of the times it was. I mean, the first final, you quoted Batley. Batley actually beat St Helens at Headingley in that first final.
Yes.
And there was about roughly 13,500 people there, which may not sound a lot today, but at that time that was considered a reasonable success. But 12 months later, the second final between Batley and Bradford at the same ground attracted almost 29,000 people. So that was showing how the competition really started to catch on. So initially, from a sort of a modest idea, modest beginning, it did grow, and crowds of 20,000 plus 30,000 became quite normal, say, over the next decade or so.
All right.
And as I say, in the context of the times, that wasn't a bad crowd.
All right, now the competition was suspended during the First World War. But Graham, I imagine that was the case for, most of the sports in Britain at the time?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. Soccer, as well as Rugby League, suspended operations during the First World War. What I've got to say is that the first wartime season, shall we say, 1914-15, everybody still went ahead with competitive matches. I think the idea there was that everybody thought there's this old story, isn't it, that it'll all be over by Christmas.
Yes.
And that's really what they thought at the time. And of course, after nearly a year, they realised that was not going to be the case. So from 1915-16 onwards, both soccer and Rugby League suspended competitive matches. There would have been an outrage anyway if they'd have carried on playing, because so many young men were being called up and losing their lives on the front.
Yes.
It just wasn't really ethical to continue. However, just speaking for Rugby League, the clubs did continue to play through the war years, but they played friendly matches against each other. And how did they get the players? Well, they'd be junior players that perhaps too young to be called up, veterans. My club, Salford, for instance, some of the players that hadn't played for nearly 10 years came back and helped the club out.
Right.
And then you had players that were on leave or whatever. So you never really knew what your team was going to be. If you look at a programme from that period, you'll see about 20 names listed, because they literally couldn't pick the team until the last minute. So
yes.
Yeah, it carried on, but on a very friendly basis.
Okay, now I just want to jump forward a little bit here to the Second World War. Now, was the competition also suspended during the Second World War?
Not exactly.
Okay.
Initially, when war broke out, was declared really by Britain and France against Germany I think it was in September of 1939, and the domestic season in England had already started. The New Zealand tourists were actually in England as well at that time.
Right.
So we played, I think we got through the first three matches, and then the competition was suspended because the Rugby League, the RFL, had to really sort of decide what was going on, what was the way forward. After a few weeks of debate and obviously waiting and monitoring the situation, the government the government of the UK actually decided that it would be good to continue with sport. It would be good for the morale of the people at home. So that's what happened. Both soccer and Rugby League continued with competitive matches, but in a very different situation to peacetime. So there would be very localised leagues.
Okay.
The British Rugby League, the English Rugby League had what was called a wartime emergency league. So there were official competitive matches, but it was very watered down. And probably before the end of the Second World War, there's probably only 50% of around about 28 clubs there were at the time war broke out. There's probably only about half of those were actually competing up till the end of the war, because a lot of the grounds were requisitioned, for instance, and in other situations, some of the clubs just couldn't afford to keep going.
Yes, and the Challenge Cup itself was continued on during the war years?
Yes, it was. The Challenge Cup was continued to be played. The first two, possibly three finals, going from memory. They had the final, but obviously not played at Wembley. It was played in the north at one of the big stadiums. I think Hunslet Stadium, possibly.
Yes.
But after the first two or three finals, that we then had two legged finals. So a home and away.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. Now, between the two wars, we have a very significant change to the Challenge Cup. The Rugby Football League votes by 13-10 to move the final to Wembley Stadium in London. Now, what were the arguments for and against this move to Wembley, Graham? Are you aware of the arguments for and against the move to Wembley?
Yeah, initially this all began because, firstly, the final was becoming more popular.
Yes.
And as it happened, we had a final in the mid-1920s, which drew in excess of 40,000 people. There wasn't a ground in the north of England, a rugby league ground, that could really accommodate the number of people who were starting to want to see the final. So I think it was in 1924.
Yes.
Oldham played Wigan at Rochdale, and the 40,000 barrier was actually breached. And that caused a lot of problems because people were encroaching onto the field of play. There's a famous story about a player actually running around the back of a horse to score a try, which might sound like a myth, but it really did happen.
Okay.
So they really had a problem with it. At the same time, Wembley Stadium had hosted its first FA Cup final, and that was in 1923, and you possibly know that was an instant hit. I mean, there was nearly 200,000 people trying to get into the ground that day in 1923, which made it the world ticket matches after that. So the success and the glamour attached to the Wembley final for soccer obviously made an impact with the Rugby League, particularly after Huddersfield Town Soccer Club also got to the final at Wembley, at the soccer final.
Okay.
So that really made a difference. So the idea was, somebody suggested at the annual meeting that maybe we should take the final to London. It would maybe put Rugby League on the calendar.
Yes.
Sporting events calendar. So there was all positive arguments for it. The negatives, of course, that some people were saying, well, why go all the way to London? It'll be a disaster. Nobody will want to watch the final. It's going to be expensive. Who's going to try, in those days as well, 1920s, who's going to, work for soccer, which was by then more popular than Rugby League, if we're honest. Who's going to go down to London to watch a Rugby League match? And the other thing was, where were we going to play it? It wasn't a done deal that it would be at Wembley. They did look at other options, including the Crystal Palace.
Okay.
But what swung it in first of all, as you said, there was a vote 13-10 in favour of moving to London. That was the first hurdle. So the decision was made, let's give it a go. Let's go to London. The next thing was the tasked members of the committee to then look into it and decide where the venue should be. Crystal Palace actually wanted almost a third of the gate as their share for staging the match, whereas Wembley were looking for a lot less, I think about 15%.
All right.
Some along those lines. So that really settled it. And that's basically how it came to Wembley. It was slightly controversial at the time. There was lots of debate, and as obviously you said, 13-10 was the vote. That's a very narrow vote.
Yes.
So you see, they really were split and divided on how this thing should go ahead.
Well, but this move, Graham, to Wembley, well, it becomes a very important part in the history of the Challenge Cup, because the Challenge Cup, I would think you could say that the prestige of the competition does improve. And I know, well, from your personal perspective, obviously, as I mentioned earlier there, you've written a few books about the Challenge Cup. How did your interest in the Challenge Cup first start?
I grew up in the 1950s.
Yes.
And in the 1950s, in sport, particularly the area I live in, we've got Manchester United, Manchester City, famous football clubs. They were getting to Wembley regular in the 50s. Rugby League in the area. I don't live that far. I follow Salford, but I've got Wigan, Warrington, St Helens, all within reach. Getting to Wembley was really, at that time in the 50s, I soon realised was the be-all and end-all. It mattered far more than winning a championship. And as important as being champions was, getting to Wembley for that big day was really what it was all about. The publicity surrounding the event, the newspaper coverage, the BBC started to show the Rugby League Cup final regularly on TV from 1958 right to the present day. You just couldn't help. It was just the glamour of it. And me as a younger person in the 50s, I thought, wow, this is really fantastic. And to see photographs of Wembley Stadium, the old Wembley Stadium with its twin towers, and I don't know, there was just a buzz about it. And I saw that first transmission in 1958 on the TV. Wigan and Workington Town. It was an exciting final. It really made an impression on me. Then in 1964, I got the chance to go to Wembley for the first time, and I was just bowled over.
Right.
Just seeing the Twin Towers in the flesh for the first time, just seeing the crowds going down Wembley Way, the glamour, the atmosphere, the camaraderie. All the fans from all the clubs were there, not just the clubs in the final.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a tradition at Wembley that all the clubs, all the supporters supported the event. They used to wear their own club colours. And just inside Wembley, I remember getting inside Wembley, which is
Yes.
a bowl shape. I was used to rectangular pitches in the north. And you could just, 100,000 people inside the stadium. You could see every one of them. And I can remember that up till half-time, it was Widnes and Hull Kingston Rovers in that final. And up to half-time, I'd hardly noticed the game. I just couldn't take it all in. And I think it was the second half before I actually concentrated. Now, that might sound very glamorised the way I've explained it, but I can promise you that lots and lots of other people felt the same. Wembley was the real mecca in those days. It was the be-all and it was the end-all. If you got to Wembley, you'd had a good season.
So would people go to London sort of for the weekend, or they just catch the train down from the north for the day? They'd catch the train on Saturday morning and go down, or were people sort of going to London and, I don't know, spending the weekend in London? And was it that sort of a scenario, Graham?
Yes, Rob, but both were actually true. People would go down for the day. There were special trains. People would go in the morning on the train and then come back in the evening. There was also special coach tours by then.
Yes, okay.
So people may go down. I went to Wembley in '69 on a coach trip for the day.
Okay.
And I had to be up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get the coach. So it's not it's not the best way to do it.
All
but
right.
There were coach trips where you possibly would go down on the Friday, watch the match on the Saturday, come back maybe Saturday night or maybe Sunday. So there were different things on offer, really.
Yes, all right.
And the other thing was that nearly every club had its own organised trip. Nearly every club in the Rugby League would be organising where the supporters would save up all year for the trip to Wembley. The coach would be organised by the club or the supporters.
Oh, right. So you could meet up.
Club.
Yeah.
And it was an annual event, and really that remained so for many, many years.
All right. Okay. Oh, okay, Graham. Now, after the Second World War, we have another sort of, I suppose you would say, a major development in the history of the Challenge Cup. We have the introduction of a Best Players Award, I suppose you would call it. This is known as the Lance Todd Trophy. Graham, what can you tell us about this, the Lance Todd Trophy?
Well, I suppose the first thing people might ask, and sometimes do, is who was Lance Todd?
Yes.
Lance Todd was a New Zealander born in Auckland, and actually came to England with the first New Zealand Rugby League touring team, the first Rugby League touring team to come to England, actually. I mean, Northern Union in those days, but still Rugby League.
Yes.
He made a big impact on the tour. He was a standoff, or I think they call it 5'8".
Yeah.
At that time. He had a good tour. Wigan took notice and signed him just towards the end of the tour. And in fact, he became a centre three-quarter for Wigan. Yeah. And he was part of what became a legendary three-quarter line at Wigan, one that had the names engraved on the stand for many years in the years following. Todd retired as a player around about 1914 at the time the war broke out. But he stayed in this country. He married a Wigan girl.
Yes.
He had various jobs. He was secretary of a quite prestigious golf club on the coast in Blackpool. Blackpool's on the coast of Lancashire.
Yes.
Famous holiday resort. And he was about to return home. He was going to take his wife back to New Zealand with him. But he was delayed because firstly she was unwell, so they delayed the return. But then an advert appeared in the paper, and Salford were asking for a secretary manager. Well, Todd had been secretary at the golf club, so he knew all about that.
Yes.
The manager of a football team, he thought he knew a little bit about that as well. So in 1928, he came to Salford. And he was a revelation. He took Salford from the bottom of the league. There was about 28 teams in the league, and it was all one league then. Salford finished near the bottom the season before he arrived. Season after this first season in charge, he took them right to the top of the league, and they stayed that way right up till the end of the 30s. They won championships. They got to Wembley twice. They won county cups, county leagues. It was a revelation. In addition to that, he built a reputation reputation, let's say, slightly aside from the actual match day experience. He became a commentator for the BBC.
Right.
So the radio broadcasts of let's say, for instance, the Wembley Challenge Cup finals, he would be involved with the broadcast of those finals. He was also a guest on sports shows on the radio. And in addition to that, he had a lot of far-reaching ideas. So he often had articles that appeared in the press.
Yes.
Possibly his most famous was the fact that he was forever pushing the idea of summer rugby league. And at the time, that didn't happen. But of course, in Britain, since the mid-1990s, that's exactly what we've had. So you could say he was ahead of his time. Unfortunately, Todd died in 1942. He was in a car accident. And several of his contemporaries wanted to remember him. Harry Sunderland, who you may know is an Australian, he was an Australian tour manager a couple of times, a journalist. He himself and a couple of other people decided to set up a memorial fund, and they decided that what they would do with the money that was generated from that fund would be to award a prize to whoever the man of the match was at Wembley. And that's what happened. So the first time that was awarded was in 1946 in the first peacetime Wembley final after the war.
All right. Now, well, okay, yes, as you said there, the first Lance Todd Trophy is 1946. The winner is Wakefield Trinity centre Billy Stott wins the first Lance Todd Trophy. But Graham, there's obviously been many winners of this trophy, but I suppose, Graham, can you just pinpoint a couple of, standout performances in the Challenge Cup? Some of the standout performances that have won the Lance Todd Trophy, are there a couple that stand out in your memory?
Yeah, well, I've got to say that there's quite a few.
Yes,
really.
there would be,
I can think of Alan Prescott, playing for St Helens in the 1950s. You may know him in Australia for famously playing in a test match. I think it was in 1958 with a broken arm, big broken collarbone, I think.
Yes.
He was a real icon of a prop forward. He had a superlative game at Wembley in the 50s. There's so many to choose from, really.
Yep.
And it's difficult sometimes to actually say that one player would stand out. I mean, you can think of some players who maybe have contributed greatly, particularly with the forwards, and often the award might go to a back who scored a hat-trick of tries, for instance. You know, sometimes it can get slightly slanted. But if I wanted to answer your question honestly and truly...
all right. Yeah.
I think there's who stands out in my mind is one particular player, and he was an Australian player.
Who was that?
So,
who was that player?
Hello, can you hear me, Rob?
Yes, Graham. Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Sorry, Rob, I'll start again. There was one particular player that stands out in my mind, and that was an Australian player. It was Brett Kenny in 1985.
Right.
I think 1985 is one of the outstanding finals anyway. Brett Kenny lined up for that match in a very nonchalant manner. He had his hands in his tracksuit pockets at the lineup, and looked as if he was completely disinterested in what was going on, which was very far from the truth. I think of all the finals that I've seen, and I've seen every single final since 1958, either being at the event itself or watching it on the television.
Yes.
It's the most complete performance I've ever seen. He was involved in just about everything that happened on the field. He made tries, he scored tries. You may well have seen a recording of that match, and it was just, his performance was just superlative. His passing, his organisation. I don't think Wembley's ever seen a performance like that before or since, certainly not in my opinion. Also, rather ironically, Peter Sterling, who was his teammate in Australia, I think with Parramatta, he had a great game as well, playing for Hull, scrum half, but unfortunately for Peter, one of the two teams had to lose, so he was on the losing side. John Ferguson was also in that game, another Australian.
Yes, Chicka Ferguson, yes.
And he had another outstanding match. So some of the most memorable performances in my mind came in that one particular game.
Yep. No. I think a lot of Australians do remember that final simply because it was the Kenny versus Sterling final. I think you'll find that Australia.
Of course, yeah.
Well, of course, Graham, one of the features of a knockout competition like the Challenge Cup is that you get the great upsets. You know, you have teams from the lower divisions winning, or you might have a very short price favourite that gets knocked out of the competition. Can you think of any examples of the great upsets in Challenge Cup history?
Well, I think there's been one or two in the finals themselves. I mean, Sheffield beating Wigan was an unexpected result in, I think it was 1998.
Yes.
But if you're talking about the earlier rounds, of course, we've got the professional, the way that the Super League's organised, of course, the way Rugby League's organised in Britain is we've got the Super League at the top level, which is fully professional, and then we've got two semi-professional divisions below them. Previously, they were all in one league and they were all semi-professional up to the mid-1970s. Actually, from the beginning of the Challenge Cup until the 1947-48 season, there were actually very few upsets.
Okay.
I think there were about 9. I did have a look at this, funnily enough, the other day, and I think there were 9 instances of amateur clubs defeating semi-professional clubs on the way to the cup final.
Okay.
So that's in nearly 50 odd years.
Yes.
And then there was no other instances until the 1990s. The idea now of an amateur club beating, let's say, a Super League club is just about impossible.
Yes.
The strength of the game at the top end and Super League end has grown enormously. I'd say there's a fairly big gap between Super League and the Championship, and certainly a big gap between Championship and League One, which is the third tier. League One is possibly the teams are perhaps not as strong even as the lower end clubs used to be in the days of just one league, whereas a lot of the amateur clubs today are quite useful. So there have been quite a few upsets, what you might call upsets anyway, where amateur clubs have met League One clubs. I should also explain that League One clubs come into the competition earlier than the Super League clubs.
Yes, they do, yes.
Sort of seeded, so they come in division by division. I can give you an instance. Dudley Hill, which is a club in Bradford, they beat Keighley.
Yep.
Charleston Rovers defeated Dewsbury.
Yes.
And East Hull, which is an amateur team, defeated Swinton. That was all in the same round on the same weekend. So that gives you an idea. It's less of a shock these days when an amateur club defeats a League One club, which is where their first access to semi-professional clubs is where the League One clubs come in. So I would say we don't have the upsets in Rugby League that we might have in soccer.
Yes, because there is.
I mean, I know we're not discussing soccer here, but in soccer terms, there's been a lot of major upsets where an amateur team has defeated a fairly high level club in the FA Cup, and that does happen occasionally. But in Rugby League, I'd say it's less so. That probably because the makeup of the game is the physicality of it, fitness levels, and all of those things. But
still, it's a huge achievement for these amateur clubs when they do beat the professional, semi-professional teams. I mean, it must be I imagine for particularly their finances, I suppose, it would be a huge achievement for them when they win those matches.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that it's so attractive to clubs to qualify for a place in the Challenge Cup is because there is a financial reward, and for amateur clubs that can mean so much for the survival.
Yep.
And as you say, it's a big deal if they beat one of the leading clubs. I mean, if you look at a website for any particular amateur club, you're going to see a mention of when they beat so-and-so in 19 whatever. It's going to be part of their history.
Yes, it does become, yeah. And Graham, what about the big occasion, the Challenge Cup final? Your book, of course, Destination Wembley, concentrates on the Challenge Cup final, and of course, well, finals can sometimes be fairly dull, dour affairs, but are there some finals that stand out for you? You've mentioned the 85 final between Wigan and Hull. Are there any other finals that stand out for you?
Yeah, I think you could say that there were. I think prior to 1985, I think by popular opinion, the 1965 final was the one that everybody remembered, and the one that was replayed several times on the BBC. That was Wigan against Hunslet. Hunslet were certainly underdogs in that match. Wigan were in the process. It was a period where Wigan actually got to Wembley, I think it was 6 times in a period of about 8 years, something like that.
Yeah.
But Wigan took an early lead. I think they kicked a penalty goal in the first minute from the halfway line.
Yep.
So Hunslet were up against it from the kick-off, and twice Wigan forged ahead on the score sheet, and twice Hunslet came back at them. It was a magnificent performance, and it was regarded as one of the great finals. I think as much as anything for the way that Hunslet fought so well, but also it was a good match. It was an attractive match to watch as well. It was an enjoyable game, and for the neutrals, like myself, it was very entertaining.
All right.
I think after that, as you've already said, some finals were wonderful displays. Some were indifferent. Some were downright terrible.
Yep.
1954, for instance, a 4-4 draw at Wembley.
Yes.
That was awful, but then it led to history because there was a replay at Hunslet Stadium, which drew well over 100,000 people.
Yes.
Hunslet Stadium being Bradford's ground, by the way.
Bradford Northern, yes.
So that although it was a dull final at Wembley, it produced history with the replay. It's still talked about that match even today. After 65, I think we'd have to say the 85 one, which I'd already mentioned, the Wigan and Hull game was just an absolute classic in every way. Superb tries.
Yes.
Wigan forging ahead, looking dead certain to win with 20 minutes or so to go, and then Hull coming back. I think with 3 tries, 3 brilliant tries.
Yes.
I don't think there was a try that wasn't brilliant in that match, to be honest. It was just superb. Since then, we've had a few matches that have actually been very close on the score sheet.
Yes.
Where it's just been perhaps 1 or 2 points separating the clubs. I can think of there was one where Halifax beat St Helens, which was another upset, and that I think there was a 1 point in it at the end. There was a famous tackle at the end of the match, which ensured that Halifax would win the trophy.
All right.
So there's always something going on. I think every final's got its own memories, and maybe even if the quality of the game isn't what you'd expect it to be, every match has its moments.
All right, now...
The classic occasions, basically.
All right, Graham, of course, in Australia here, one of the standouts in Australian Rugby League history is, of course, the performance of the St George team when they won 11 premierships in a row in the 90s.
I was aware of that,
Yes.
They just dominated, didn't they?
Well, I think one of the standouts in English Rugby League history must be the performance of the Wigan team that won 8 Challenge Cups in a row between 1987 and 1995. What can you tell us about this Wigan team, that Wigan team that won 8 Challenge Cup finals in a row?
Well, that all came really off the back of a period of mediocrity, I suppose, by Wigan standards. In the 1970s, they just hadn't been the club that you traditionally expect Wigan to be.
Yes.
Where they're always up and about chasing trophies. The days of Billy Boston and Eric Ashton, they'd passed. Then in 1982, a 4-man board, a 4-man consortium, if you like, took over the club, led by Maurice Lindsay.
Yes.
and they decided that they were going to spend big. They were going to bring in. They started modestly at first with some expensive signings, but not perhaps top of the range signings. But the point was to try and improve the quality of the team, which they did. And then, of course, eventually, just about every outstanding player that they could get hold of from other clubs, basically, at the time.
Yes.
You talked about Andy Gregory, Martin Afire,
yes.
Andy Goodway, Joe Lydon, and of course, Ellery Hanley. They were all signed for big fees. And a few players from your part of the world, plus possibly 2 New Zealanders that stand out in Kevin Iro and Dean Bell.
Yes.
So they had a pretty powerful team. The Wigan crowd responded to that suddenly from 4,000 or 5,000 people turning up at matches, which is how it had fallen to at Wigan in the 70s. It would have suddenly the big 5-figure crowds were appearing again. As you say, they completely dominated Rugby League. Probably a lot of jealousy around at the time. But as you say, they won Wembley 8 times, but not just that. They also won the championship 7 years running during that period as well.
Yes.
And there was lots of other trophies available at that time. We had several other county cup competitions and various cup competitions around at the time, and they mopped up most of those as well. They were virtually unbeatable, really, but their quality.
Yes.
I mean, that was virtually the Great Britain team, was the Wigan team, really, at that time.
Well, I can remember, if you look back through the highlights of those finals, the one thing that did stand out was some incredible long-range tries. They would score tries from one end of the field to the other. I can remember in the first final against Halifax, for instance, I think might have been one of the Iro brothers or something, virtually made a break from the kickoff, and Martin Afire ran the length of the... Oh, no, it was Ellery Hanley, sorry.
Ellery Hanley, yes, he had an outstanding match.
Yeah. And there was another incredible try in one of the finals against Leeds. Martin Afire virtually ran from one end of the field to the other to score a try. But you're right. I think when you look at those highlights of those matches, definitely the influence of Andy Gregory and Sean Edwards, the halves pairing there, they were very dominant, obviously, during that period.
Yeah, Sean Edwards was phenomenal, really.
Yeah.
If you look at his Wembley record, it's quite amazing. He played at Wembley 11 times and won 9 of those, so
okay.
Quite phenomenal. And the Martin Afire try that you mentioned,
yes.
He did that from a play-the-ball situation, almost on his own line. They're just memories that stand out. I mean,
yes.
Things like that you just don't forget, really.
And, of course, this incredible run, we were talking earlier there about upsets, but when the run ended, it was quite an incredible upset when Wigan were beaten there by, I believe it was Salford were in the second division at that stage when they defeated...
That's right, and I was at that game. It was one of those moments where you got to pinch yourself, really.
Right, okay.
Salford... it was in one of the rounds. Salford were at home to Wigan. Really not probably given much of a chance.
No.
It was just at the birth of Super League in this country. I think it was 1996. Salford played really well that day, as indeed they would have had to. There were several ex-Wiganers as well at Salford. I mean, the coach at Salford was Andy Gregory, for a start.
Okay.
Steve Hampson was Salford's fullback on that day.
Yep.
He played at Wembley with Wigan many times, and it left not in the best situation. So he was doubly pleased to put one up over Wigan on the day.
Yes.
It was just one of those days. It was a shock to Wigan. It was a shock to the Rugby League public, and I think it was as much a shock to the Salford fans at the time.
Right.
It was history, and it's still remembered in Salford, really. You talk about the great upsets being remembered by a particular club, and that's certainly one of them from Salford's point of view.
All right, now, Graham, one of the more recent developments in the history of the Cup has been the introduction of the international teams into the competition. We've seen teams from outside Britain joined the Cup. Of course, in 2018, the French team, the Catalan Dragons, won the Challenge Cup. They defeated Warrington
right,
then.
yeah.
But we've seen, we've seen the Toronto Wolfpack, Moscow, Red Star Belgrade enter the competition. What has this meant for the Challenge Cup, do you think?
For the Challenge Cup itself, I wouldn't say it's meant that much. I would say the only way it's impacted is on what you just said, that the Catalans actually winning in 2018, and that's the second time they reached the final at Wembley.
Yes.
So that, it's a big publicity event. That's a French team in a domestic cup final. That created a lot of publicity, and it was massive for the game in France. But what I would say is, Catalans are in Super League, and before them, Paris Saint-Germain were temporarily in Super League, and Toronto Wolfpack were in Super League. But for most of the clubs, not most, but all of the other clubs are all at a far lower level. So we're talking about French clubs coming in and clubs from Russia and places like that. I think it was done more to help to develop interest in the game in those particular countries, more than benefiting the actual game in, let's say, in the UK or the competition here. I think it was more for the benefit of those countries. There's been quite a number of French clubs have been invited to take part.
Right.
Similarly, the clubs from several other countries, a club from Belgrade, for instance.
Yes.
That's been going on for a while, and not only clubs, I would call them overseas clubs, because of course Britain's an island, but also other British territories. If we look at Wales, Scotland, and also Ireland, we've had invited teams from those countries, if I can call them countries, to take part as well. But that's all been to encourage the development and promotion of the game in those particular countries, more than perhaps the actual benefit of the game itself.
All right.
In England.
All right. And finally, Graham, just on the future of the Challenge Cup. Firstly, the immediate future, because we're going through a COVID-19 pandemic, and this year's Challenge Cup has been suspended. We were down to the last 16 teams, I believe, when the competition was stopped. So has any decision been made about this year's competition? Can you bring us up to date on what that situation is?
Yes, I can. As you say, we were up to the round of the last 16, and that didn't take place because of the COVID epidemic. Rugby League has now restarted in this country at Super League level. I think mostly because of the television commitments, if we're honest, without actually having people in the ground, apart from the players and the officials. The only problem was that of those 16 teams that were left in the competition, 11 of them were Super League teams and 5 were clubs outside of Super League, part-time teams, and really it just wasn't practical for them to start up again for one-off matches.
Right.
So they reluctantly had to withdraw from the competition. Also, Toronto were one of the 11 Super League clubs left in the competition, and because of restrictions in that country, in Canada, that's made it difficult for them to continue this season. So they've had to withdraw not only from the Challenge Cup but from Super League itself for this season.
Yes.
So that's left us with 10 Super League clubs. It was an impractical situation. The first decision made was to make the draw again. The draw had already been made for that round.
Yes.
But they needed a new draw. So a draw was made. 4 clubs were picked out of the hat. For the next round, which would have been the round of the last 16, but there's only 4 clubs in it. One of those matches actually took place last weekend, when Catalan Dragons defeated Wakefield Trinity. There's another match still outstanding from that round, and then we're down to the last 8. But we're really talking Super League clubs now. So the competition has restarted, and it is scheduled to be played at Wembley, but obviously it's a much later date than it would have been. I mean, if the competition had gone ahead, we would have by now already had the final.
All right, and what about the long-term future of the Challenge Cup, Graham? There's been some, just reading through some of the press reports of that, there seems to be some concerns about crowd numbers in recent times. What do you think about the long-term future of the Cup?
I do think it will continue continue, but I think there is a problem in arresting what I'd say was its decline, if I'm brutally honest.
Uh-huh.
I mentioned the 1950s when getting to Wembley mattered
Yes.
a lot, and I would say that situation continued certainly into the 1990s, but probably in the last 10, 20 years there's been a slight diminishing where the Super League has become the prominent feature of the game, the one that seems to be promoted. It might be because of TV, giving such a lot of publicity with Sky TV. They certainly push very hard with the Super League, and I'm glad that they do. The Challenge Cup is traditionally covered by the BBC, possibly doesn't get the same focus. There has been a dropping of interest. I've got to say also, this is true in the FA Cup. There was a time when the FA Cup in soccer and the Challenge Cup in Rugby League, those times would draw far, far bigger crowds than the equivalent league matches.
Yes.
The same isn't true anymore. And now the league matches in both codes will draw the crowds. The cup competitions don't get as many. I don't know. The public don't seem to see the Rugby League Challenge Cup and the FA Cup quite in the same way that they did maybe 20 years ago. What's going wrong? You could put your finger on one or two things. I could probably come up with a list of different things that have changed. I think one of the most significant things, of course, is we've got Super League now.
Yes.
The teams in the Super League are so powerful compared to the other semi-professional clubs. There's very little likelihood of a Featherstone Rovers or a Batley or a Swinton or an Oldham getting to Wembley. So that's diminished interest in nearly 2/3 of the clubs.
Yes, okay.
So these annual trips to Wembley that I've talked about, the coach trips, they probably don't happen quite as often now. So that's made a difference. There's so many different things. I think the fact that we've gone to a summer schedule, so the cup finals played at a different time of year, where it's traditionally always played in April and May at the end of our winter season. It's now, the latest situation was due to be played in July.
Right.
This year. That would have been a first. The last few years it's been in August. And before that, when we first started with Summer Rugby League, we still had it in May, which essentially meant the Challenge Cup was almost a pre-season competition. So that really diminished its status.
Yes.
There's not as many people travelling to Wembley now, which is sad. We used to get 90,000 plus at Wembley. If I look at the attendances for the last 3 years, when they moved to the new Wembley in, I think it was 2009, I think it was. We were still getting reasonable crowds. The capacity at the new Wembley isn't as high as it was. The old Wembley at one time could accommodate 100,000. The new Wembley is about 85,000. And certainly for the first final at Wembley, they were filling the stadium. But over the last 10 years, it's reduced. And if we look at the 2016 final, we had just over 76,000 at the final.
Yes.
Still not bad. But then the year after, it had dropped to 68,000. Then in 2018, it was only 50,000. Last year, it was 62,000. So they're not bad numbers. But compared to the 80s and the 90s that we used to get, it's dropped. And there is a concern about that.
All right.
I don't know what you do about it. The Rugby League themselves have tried all sorts of different things, with promotions, with tickets, and thinking about with the timing and the schedule. Also, Rugby League, the Challenge Cup has to fit in with the BBC schedules, where it used to have a nice rhythm to it at one time, where the competition would take place every 2 weeks, each round, fortnight after the previous.
Yes.
So it had a nice rhythm to it, which built up interest. We don't have that anymore because we're competing with the summer schedule. So you've got cricket with the test matches, you've got Wimbledon, you've got the Open Golf tournaments.
Yes, okay.
All these events that take place in the summer and part of the British national sporting calendar makes it difficult for BBC or for Rugby League to find a slot with the BBC. So you're finding that the the rounds are actually, you can have one round a week after a previous round, and the next round might be 2 months away.
Yes,
so
okay.
Again, that reduces interest.
Yeah.
There are lots of different reasons, and it's very difficult to say what the real crux of it is. It's probably a combination of several things.
All right.
I'm sure the competition will survive, but maybe not with the massive crowds that we had.
That's the way it was. The history of the Rugby League Challenge Cup. My name's Rob Corra. On behalf of Graham Morris, this program was produced by Tony Peterson. Until next time, may the force be with you.